Okay, so let's dive into a real historical head scratcher. For decades, cannabis was basically public enemy number one in America. But how did that happen? I mean, how does a plant that people used for centuries, for everything from paper to medicine, get such a terrible reputation? Well, that's what we're here to find out.
And that's the big question our source material for this explainer really digs into. It argues the answer isn't just, a slow shift in social norms. Nope. It points to a deliberate, full-on campaign run by one incredibly powerful man who had a massive conflict of interest. The story our source lays out is a pretty compelling one. It suggests that the war on cannabis actually began as a war to protect a business empire. And right at the center of that empire was a man who basically perfected the art of shaping what everyone thinks. And that man's name? William Randolph Hearst. Now, you might know him as the inspiration for that classic film Citizen Kane, but the account we're looking at suggests his real-life influence was way more direct, with consequences that would last for nearly 100 years. You gotta understand, Hearst wasn't just some newspaper owner. He was a media titan. In the early 20th century, his empire of newspapers, magazines, and radio stations reached millions of Americans every single day. He didn't just report the news, he had the power to create the narrative. And, as this story goes, he was fiercely protective of his business interests. And this, right here, was his primary tool: yellow journalism. It was all about grabbing your attention with shocking, sensational stories. Facts were often, let's say, secondary to selling papers and pushing an agenda. The theory goes that Hearst mastered this technique and was about to aim it directly at a new target. So this brings us to the million-dollar question. Why on earth would a media mogul declare war on a plant? Well, the source points to a motive that's as old as time: money and power. See, it wasn't about the intoxicating effects of cannabis, but the industrial potential of its cousin, hemp. The conflict of interest is laid out pretty clearly here. Hearst owned huge amounts of timberlands, and his entire newspaper empire ran on paper made from wood pulp. Hemp, on the other hand, was this versatile, renewable resource that could be made into paper much more cheaply. According to this account, Hearst saw hemp not as an innovation, but as a direct threat to his bottom line. This quote really captures the alleged mindset perfectly. Faced with a competitor that could disrupt his entire industry, Hearst chose not to compete, but to eliminate the threat completely. And his method? A full-blown media assault. So how'd he do it? The narrative breaks it down into a deliberate, three-step smear campaign. This was a calculated strategy to turn public opinion against all forms of the cannabis plant by tapping into the social anxieties of the time. The campaign had three key parts. First, create fear. Hearst's papers allegedly linked cannabis use to Mexican immigrants and African Americans, really stoking racial prejudice. Second, fabricate stories. His newspapers were filled with these wild tales of marijuana-crazed people committing horrible crimes. And third, rebrand the enemy. They intentionally used the foreign-sounding marijuana to make the whole thing sound alien and dangerous. This wasn't random at all. Each piece of the campaign was designed with a single goal: to transform the public's perception of a useful plant into a terrifying social menace that demanded government action. And the campaign absolutely worked. The constant barrage of sensational headlines created a moral panic. What started as fake news printed on wood pulp paper was about to be cemented into federal law with devastating and long-lasting consequences. This timeline shows you just how effective the whole thing was. In the early 30s, the fear-mongering starts. By the mid-30s, you've got politicians and police actually citing these newspaper articles as evidence of a drug menace. And the result? By 1937, the federal government steps in. 1937. That's the pivotal year. The Marijuana Tax Act didn't just criminalize the plant, it decimated the American hemp industry. The narrative concludes that for Hearst, this was a massive victory. His competition was eliminated, and his timber and paper empire was secure. Ultimately, the source frames this entire historical episode as a cautionary tale. It wasn't about public safety, it was about protecting profits. It's a story of a powerful entity using its influence to squash a disruptive technology before it could even get started. So, what are the key takeaways here? Well, there are a few big ones. It's a huge cautionary tale about propaganda. It shows the incredible power of media to mold what we believe. And maybe most importantly,
It's a reminder that the damage from misinformation, well, it can echo for generations.
And that leaves us with a final, powerful question. This story isn't just about the past. It's a stark reminder to always question the narratives we're given, to ask who benefits from them, and to really think about whose stories are shaping the world we live in right now. Thanks for joining us.